I think we can go ahead and get started now. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this STEM-LINC webinar entitled um, Grant Strategies for STEM Librarians. So I just ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of the webinar. And if you'd like to put them in the chat, then we'll be sure to answer them from there, or you can just unmute yourself at the end of the webinar. So these are our panelists. So we have Ryan Gottlieb. He is the Science and Engineering Liaison for the John B. Coleman Library at Prairie View A&M University. And we have Dr. Colin Post, I'm sorry. He's the Assistant Professor of Information, Library, and Research Sciences at UNCG. And we have Katie Kehoe, her pronouns are she, her, hers. And she's the University Program Specialist at the FD Bluford Library at North Carolina A&T State University. And I'm Candace Jacobs. I'm an assistant professor / STEM liaison librarian here at UNCG. So this is today's agenda. So we're actually going to be covering topics such as finding STEM grants for librarians, building collaborations between librarians and LAS faculty, and design thinking for grants. So now I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start off with finding STEM grants for libraries, and I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our talk. I'm going to provide an overview of finding grants with an emphasis on STEM funding for libraries. To center our conversation, I'd like us just to begin with reflecting on the foundational questions for your grant search. First, what need are you trying to meet, or what problem you are trying to solve by applying for funding? And second, who is interested in solving the same kind of problems or meeting the same kinds of needs as your project? So you can take a moment and you could either put the answer to the first question in the chat, or you can pull out a piece of paper and just brainstorm your response to that first question. Just take a moment to think about, what are you trying to solve? And so when you arrive at the answer to that first question, which you do not have to share your answer with anyone, this is for yourself to be reflecting on. What you're going to find is search terms to help you navigate databases that will allow you to find funders who are interested in your work. So for example, you might be looking to help graduate students who need additional support with learning data analysis tools. So what you're looking for is for a funder who's also interested in supporting graduate students in research education. And this might be a funder focused in libraries, or they might be interested in a broad setting and could choose to support libraries or choose to support another location for where this funds goes. So here are some additional examples. Could you go to the next slide? So this might look like an academic library that is seeking regional support to support AI training and teaching and research for their library faculty. It might look like a public library who's interested in increasing access to STEM spaces for kids. Or for a school library, there might be a need for students to learn about STEM careers. For an archive, this might look like pertaining to critical materials to the history of science that need preservation. For example, primary documents that are related to the history of Black women in physics might need to be made more widely available to the public for research. So these are all examples of needs or problems that need to be solved. And on the right, I look at what kind of funders might be interested in solving these problems. Now, if you look at this list, only one out of these 4 grants specifically calls itself a STEM grant. What we're looking at here really is seeing what kind of funder might be interested broadly in the kind of problem we're looking at. So for that leadership grant, they're interested in training librarians at a national level. And this training might include STEM training. If we're looking at the Digitizing Hidden Collections grant, that's a grant specifically for archives and digitization, and they're looking to make more public histories that might previously have not been known by digitizing materials. So this could be related to STEM in the sense that you are hoping to make the history of Black women in the sciences more available. Or our LSTA grants, they are broadly funding libraries and often will fund these STEM projects. So I think we've got to think beyond this idea of, oh, I'm looking specifically for a STEM grant, and then think more focused on what kind of need am I trying to solve, and are they interested in a need that intersects with STEM? A common mistake that I see when people are looking for grants is to search for a grant that is to buy stuff. For example, your library wants to purchase a 3D printer, and you're looking for a grant that will purchase a 3D printer. You're not going to get a lot of search results in the databases if that's what you're looking for. It might be an allowable cost, but it's not really the central goal that a funder is looking to meet. What I would ask you to do or challenge you to do is really think about why you want this technology. Is there a program that patrons need or a problem that you can solve that can only be solved with that additional resource, and focus on that need? And what you'll find is you're probably going to be able to purchase far more than that 3D printer. You might end up creating a maker space, or you might end up being able to have collaborations with different classes on your campus if you're in a university library. So really think about that. Can we go to the next slide? So once you have clearly spelled out the need or the problem that you are trying to solve, you are going to be able to identify a funder and the places to begin your search. So I'm going to go over 3 different categories of funding in this talk. The first is public dollars or government funding. The second is private dollars. This might be a foundation. This might be from nonprofits that support libraries. And the final one that I'm going to go over is research dollars for individuals. And this might come from public dollars or government funding, or it might come from private funding. So I'm going to start with this government dollars we have here. So the largest government funder of libraries is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. And IMLS distributes LSTA funds, or Library Services and Technology Act. That's what it stands for. So they distribute millions of dollars to state libraries, and then state libraries distribute that money to their region. And this can be done through grant funding, or in some states, they do it through formulas based on need and population. And this funding can be used for STEM projects. It can also be used more widely for library projects. The next place that I would look for STEM funding, if really that's what you're interested in, is the National Science Foundation. So this funds research in sciences, but it also funds education in the sciences for 2 groups. First, for underserved groups in STEM, so women and minorities, and then second, they look to fund careers in STEM that we really are going to need more of, but that currently people are not going into. So if you're a library looking to apply for an NSF grant, you're going to want to think about how you might partner with a research faculty member to apply for these grants. And this might look like partnering to either use library spaces for those education components. It might look like partnering so that faculty are able to access a population they might not have been able to access to before in their research. So you really have to think, how can you come at this grant so that it works for your library? And then if you're just looking for an overview of public funding at the federal level, grants.gov has everything. It has all the government agencies that provide grants, and you can sit and sift through that and see what might fit your library. And it will have all the IMLS grants listed as well. I would recommend, and may I share my screen briefly? I think I have the power to do that. I would recommend, when you have a sense of what you want to do, to actually go to the libraries, go to the website of the funder you're seeking to know more about, rather than the grants.gov website, because you're going to get a more targeted, more in-depth look at what kind of grants that you can see. So they have their own database, and you can search the awarded grants. You can apply for grants through these sites. You can manage your rewards. And really, a good way to learn whether or not your program fits is to read and search through these awarded grants, or even to become a reviewer. And that's something that people always need, is peer reviewers. A lot of these grants run on the peer review process, just like peer-reviewed journals do. All right, can we go back to the slides? Our next section that we're going to talk about is private dollars. So the thing to note about private funding, and I'll give Candace a second, is that they are not obligated to post their funding online or in any public space the way that public dollars are obligated to. So there's lots of foundations in America that offer funding for libraries or for nonprofits, but they might not say that this is something that they do. So it's going to take a bit more research, but luckily we're all librarians, so we have the ability to do that. If your university subscribes to Candid, this is a database of foundations and nonprofits. And you can learn about nonprofits like the Alfred Sloan Foundation, which specializes in STEM funding. Another way to get at this private money is to begin looking at the nonprofit organizations associated with libraries. So an example of this might be ALA. ALA has their own database for grants that are funded by different committees through ALA or different library organizations that are national. There's CLEAR, and they fund libraries at the national level. And then you might look at your state library organizations. You might even see if NCLA funds grants. So really making that list and diving in. All right, can we go to the next slide? So if you're an individual researcher, the two databases that I would look at would be SPIN, which stands for Sponsored Programs of Information Network, and Pivot. So these databases primarily are for research faculty. So for example, if you are a faculty member in a SILS program and you're looking to research on a specific subject within libraries, this is where you can find funding. And this will draw both from private and public sources. So it will have a lot of what grants.gov has in it, but it also might have some foundations that are interested in supporting specific research needs. And you'll find that you'll see different foundations in different databases because, again, foundations are not obligated to advertise their funding. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here are some more grant search strategies. So I really encourage people to go beyond the databases to find grants. So one of the ways to do that is to read library news widely. So here's an example of how this might work in your grant search. So as part of my reading, I came across an article from NC State University, and this is a grant that NC State Libraries won, and they partnered with the Academic Data Science Alliance to lead a Models for Data Science Consulting and Collaboration in Higher Ed workshop series. And this was funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So if I were sitting here trying to collect foundations that I might want to look towards for applying for grants, I know several things about them already. One, that they are providing money for STEM. Two, that they are providing money to libraries. So I might go and look them up. And let's see, I'm just going to go to their About page. They are focused on original research related to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and economics. So they could be a good funder for me to look at if I'm interested in funding those kind of projects within my library. And so really doing that research, whenever you come across a foundation that might be a good place for your work, add it to a list, maintain that document, keep it updated, and then subscribe to newsletters of grant agencies. So for example, NSF, NEH, CLEAR, all have newsletters that publish grant announcements and grant winners, which is really important for you to follow if you're really interested in grant funding. Another option is to partner with organizations who are interested in solving the same kind of problems or meeting the same kinds of needs as you. So that second question that I asked doesn't necessarily apply for funders. It also applies to partners. So you can really think about who wants to do the same kind of work that you want to do to really meet the needs of your patrons. And this expands the possibilities both for quality programming and for the grants that you qualify for, because many grants might be interested in a certain kind of organization, but love partnerships and will give kind of bonus points on their rubric if you have partnered. The final kind of creative way that I like to look for money, particularly those foundation funds, are to focus on nonprofits. So I'm going to pull up an example of Greensboro Bound. They are a literary nonprofit in our city, Greensboro, and they focus on working on literacy for kids, but also doing a larger festival. And they do a number of other projects that are free to the public surrounding books. So one of the things that I'll do is I'll go to the supporters page because I'm like, oh, they're not quite doing the same work as us, but they might be doing similar work to a public library. And I have a whole list of people that might be interested in funding literacy work. So I can look at the Edward Armfield Foundation, the Ruth Lands Memorial Fund. You might look at this, you might be, oh, here's another library that I could partner with. If you're thinking along those lines, you have the National Endowment for the Arts. And so even though they're not, say, STEM funding, maybe you're doing, you want to grow your STEM collections of books, right? And maybe you're looking at it for kids. So these might be a list of people to look at. And don't sell yourself short when you're like, oh, maybe they're not interested in this. If you see Cone Health and the Wellspring Life Plan community, they donated at least $5,000 to these kind of issues. So really expanding your network, thinking about grants in a way that is beyond necessarily the typical funders can expand the funding that you have for your library. So I'm going to go over one more thing and then I'm going to turn the conversation over to our colleagues. I have made for this talk can you all see my screen still? Give me a thumbs up, someone. I see no thumbs up. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. I have a Finding Library resource guide, and this goes over a lot of the information that I have talked about today, but it also goes over some other pieces of information, such as tips for finding conference funding, resources. So Library Grants blog, all they do is just publish library grants that have just been released, a little bit about writing grants and some resources on managing grants, and a bit about the federal agencies that provide funding. So just because it doesn't say library in front of it, these are opportunities to perhaps find funding, partnerships, to really think about how you might use some of this public dollars to support your institution. All right. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it on to Colin.
Great, thanks, Katie. So Katie has just been talking a lot about defining problems for your library or your institution and aligning those problems or needs that you see with potential funders. And I'm going to come at this from sort of a complementary angle of thinking about building those partnerships that Katie was just mentioning to develop compelling research cases or problems in your institution that you want to address through grant funding. And the specific kind of partnership that I want to focus on is developing partnerships between librarians and faculty members in library and information science degree programs. There's really sort of a natural fit, obviously, between LAS faculty and librarians. Virtually all librarians at some point go through an ALA accredited MLAS program, and many LAS faculty members were also librarians at other points in their careers. And obviously, the work that librarians are doing is in direct conversation and relationships to the kinds of research and scholarship that LIS faculty members are doing. So there's already this kind of natural partnership and a lot of um, overlaps and commonalities between the work that librarians are doing and the work that LIS faculty members are doing. And I want to think about ways to leverage those existing partnerships and relationships for the specific purpose of pursuing grant funding. So we're looking at pursuing grant funded projects like Katie was talking about. We are really thinking about what is some kind of problem or issue or need that we're seeing in our libraries or other kinds of information institutions like archives, museums, other information intensive institutions, right? Um, and one way to come at this is thinking about what kinds of research is being done by LIS faculty members that overlaps or feeds into the kinds of issues or problems or challenges that you're facing in a library or other type of information institution. And I really see a lot of the stuff I get most excited about in the library world and in the information science world are where I see those uh, cross-pollination, cross-communication between research and practice, between theory and practice. So where LIS faculty are doing work that feeds back into libraries, and where libraries and librarians are contributing to the research that LIS faculty members are doing. And I think that as a field, as a discipline, area of professional practice, we really help each other and strengthen each other by working together in these ways. And one particular way we can do that is by pursuing grant-funded projects to advance the kinds of initiatives and efforts that we want to see happen in libraries. Can you advance to the next slide, Candace? So I've just been talking sort of generally about, why these kinds of relationships are important and the sort of powerful things that can happen when librarians and LIS faculty and researchers work together. But what is sort of like the way to build these relationships? Because like sort of, in theory, it's all well and good. Yeah, librarians and LIS faculty members should collaborate and should build partnerships with each other. But how does it actually happen? And so a lot of the ways that this happens, like I was talking about, is through, the kinds of organic relationships that develop because of the overlaps in our areas, right? A lot of professional conferences attract both librarians and LIS faculty members. As I was saying before, librarians go through MLIS degree programs at some point, so you might have a former professor that you now want to collaborate with as a colleague. But another way to approach this is through more strategically seeking out individuals that you see align with issues or challenges that you're experiencing in your library or other type of information institution. So if you are trying to address some sort of problem or issue in your library and you want to pursue grant funding to develop a project to address that problem, you might want to partner with an LIS faculty member doing research that correlates to the issue that you're facing. So going back to like an example that Katie mentioned, right, of wanting to build like a makerspace or something in your library and pursuing grant funding to acquire some of the material resources that you'll need to build out that makerspace, you might want to partner with an LIS faculty member who is doing research or has done research on makerspaces. There happens to be a colleague of mine, Dr. Heather Moorfield-Lang, who's done a lot of research on makerspaces, and she would be a great partner to collaborate with on a project where you're looking at the impact of makerspaces in your library. So, look through the various journals or other types of kind of, gray literature like blog posts or conference presentations to see who's out there that is doing the kind of scholarship or more sort of theoretical research work that you see informing the project that you want to get funded for your library. And then as a next step, reach out to those individuals, either, at those kinds of conferences where these faculty members are also in attendance, or just reaching out via email and starting a conversation. And from those initial conversations, see if there's an interest in doing some kind of collaboration to build toward a project, a grant-funded project. And I'll also say too that a lot of these kinds of partnerships or collaborations can sort of develop over time and take time to develop, right? Like any kind of relationship. So even if there's not some specific grant project that you have in mind right now, you might start to build these relationships with LAS faculty members that you see doing kinds of work that you are interested in or inspired by. And eventually, that relationship might develop into some sort of collaboration or larger partnership. Can you go to the next slide, please, Candace? So I'm sure that you all are aware, but there are a number of MLIS degree programs here in North Carolina, and we're actually somewhat not unique, but we have more MLIS degree programs in our state than is typical of most states, especially for a state of our size. So you definitely do not need to stay local in the kinds of collaborations that you are building, because it's possible to obviously make these kinds of relationships and collaborations virtually with people, LAS faculty members all over the country or the world. But especially for projects that have some sort of local impact or more regional scope of their impact, partnering with faculty members in your surrounding area can be easier and more powerful, lead to more sort of powerful results particular to your local area. So faculty at UNCG, UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina Central, and East Carolina all have library science programs, information science programs, with faculty doing great work in a lot of different areas. Here, the next slide, please, Candace. And then just to kind of wrap up, I want to give an example of how this all has played out for me personally, speaking from the LAS faculty member side. So a current project that I'm working on right now that's funded by the IMLS, Digital Games in Libraries, grew out of these kinds of relationships that I've been talking about over the last several minutes. So when I first started at UNCG a few years ago, part of my emerging research interests were in how libraries collect, preserve, and provide access to video games of different kinds. So I started to talk with folks at Jackson Library here at UNCG to get a better sense of how they were working with games and their collections, some of the issues that they were running into. And through those conversations, I realized that there was this gap in practice in how libraries manage game collections, where libraries don't really have great strategies or approaches for collecting games that are only released as digital downloads through platforms like Steam or online console stores. And so from those conversations I was having with librarians at UNCG, realized that this was a bigger problem across librarianship more broadly, that could really be addressed effectively through pursuing grant-funded research. So from those conversations, I developed a grant proposal that involves folks at Jackson Library to pursue more research with a practical focus on developing strategies for collecting digital games in libraries. So this is sort of a success story, so to speak, of these kinds of collaborations and relationships that I've been talking about. So I will leave it there and hand things over to Brian.
Hello. So my experience as a librarian is um, kind of just starting out. I learned a lot from just preparing for this presentation. I wanted to kind of talk about the grant writing process as a process, of course, and kind of like a higher level, more general than my previous presenters, because um, I just wanted to kind of hammer home the point that, somewhere between 10 to 30% of grants are accepted. And so that's where design thinking comes in, where you're prototyping, planning, and empathizing with with your community members and with your stakeholders, which are going to be people affected by your grant, um, and as an iterative process. So in the inspiration, ideation, and implementation, that's a very simplified way of looking at things. Some models of design think have um, things like empathizing and prototyping and testing. Those are all also important things because people really respond to plans, and I think that um, when you're planning how you want to use your grant, it's very important to kind of tackle that as a project that is not static. You are trying to capture a very complex and measurable outcome, where as if you end up getting the grant, that's great. However, if you don't, you got to come back to this and like maybe reassess how you could visualize that impact a little more, or um, kind of think critically about why your project didn't get accepted. So if you go to the next slide, please. Um, that kind of leads into taking risk into account. I don't have another arrow-based graphic on here. This is from Megan Oakleaf. Um, Her book, The Academic Library Impact Starter Kit, is kind of where I started out on thinking about grant writing as a design thinking process. Because you can see there's a lot of reflection and continuous improvement. And when you're taking risk into account, i.e., which is essentially how things could go wrong, you want to identify maybe contingency plans. Um, if your program, such as the Digital Games and Libraries program, there's a potential that it's not widely used. And in that case, you have to have a contingency plan. So that's kind of what I mean by taking risk into account. Internal and external stakeholders, be as specific as you need to be with this, because um, that all goes back to kind of what Katie was saying about um, your interested parties and finding the right funder. Um, if you are very rigorous with the community members, researchers, funders, or the patrons of your library, um, there might be something to take into account there with this iterative process in design think. So going back to that, um, maybe you have a new stakeholder that you hadn't thought of in the past, and that might be an opportunity, an avenue for finding more grant funding. Um, Auditing data sounds kind of serious. However, it's simply just collecting metrics. Um, Not only do you want to be collecting metrics throughout the process of your overall project, but the project of grant writing itself, you'll kind of say how you plan to collect data because people really respond well to plans. They really like to see, oh, this is how it's gonna shake out in terms of the numbers. Um, and then impact assessment and reporting are all closely related. Um, yeah, kind of what I want to say about that is just um, that there are going to be some qualitative assessments. So not only are you going to kind of want to um, collect as many surveys as possible, and like those are kind of going to be short answers. And one kind of downside of surveys is that people who like to complete surveys are going to be the ones responding to your survey. So that's something to keep in mind. And then you're going to also want more kind of long form um, impact measures, maybe take into account case studies or testimonials from individuals. And we can move on to the next slide. I just wanted to leave you guys with some resources and references that I was kind of leaning on for the design thinking aspect. I put stars next to this one. Um, Finding funding titles to navigate grant writing. And I realize here that this is the actually a review original of the original book, but it's a good place to start. I highly recommend that resource. Um, and then there's just some kind of general things here on fundamentals of planning and assessment in libraries. This is a ALA publication, and even though it was written a few years ago, in 2021, I found it to be pretty relevant um, to kind of give your grant a, a kind of living and breathing feel, a very on a grand scale. Um, I do recommend kind of thinking about design elements. And by that, I mean iterative process might be nonlinear, but everything should be documented and paid careful attention to in order to get your grant some legs. Um, that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say, and I'll turn it over to Candace.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you all so very, very much for your knowledge and expertise on these topics. Can we all give our presenters a virtual round of applause, please? All right, so now we're going to open the floor for questions. And again, thank you all so much for your time and willingness to share with all of us. So let's see, does anyone have any questions? You can either put the question in the chat or you can just unmute yourselves. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. What's been your favorite / most interesting grant that you applied for?
I worked with the archives on our campus to apply for a Recordings at Risk grant for African American home movies from like the 1930s. And I think the earliest one was earlier than that, like 1920s, and it's some of the first like available footage that we have that was done as like a home movie for people of color in the United States. And it's very rare and really cool to see because a lot of times people didn't have access to that, much less African Americans during that time. And it was funded. So you can go and watch some of these movies online. Yeah, I'll pull that up from an institutional repository.
I think that my favorite is the one that I mentioned in my part of the presentation that I'm working on right now, the um, Digital Games and Libraries project. But another sort of related one that I'll mention, which got funded through internal funding from UNCG, which is sort of another source of funding to look at too, if there's, funding within your institution, like seed money to start a project that you could then take it to the next step with an external funder. Um, this is another good example of that. I got funding with a colleague of mine in the English department to uh, host game jams in the library. And we were thinking about ways that libraries and librarians could help support learning through making games and learning about game design tools. So yeah, sort of an example of like an internally funded project that also helped to pursue this larger source of external funding.
I will say a project I was working on was they call it a makerspace, although its main focus is alleviating what is called mathematical anxiety. So it brings in artistic expression um, to students within the library. Um, Again, I don't really have too much experience with writing grants, but the process of this one is very involved to try to quantify the impact and all that. But um,
We have another question. It says, what advice would you give a novice grant writer in things to avoid when writing a grant?
I'm going to start what I would tell them to do. So answer all the questions and answer them fully and directly, with as much information as you can. What I would avoid is trying to write in partners at the last minute without really investigating who you're partnering with. And I would avoid generalizations. So I call it get that over there language. Or even, and I think that that's where, you're writing something and people aren't quite sure what you're talking about, or are using kind of, these buzzwords without defining them. Um, really just be genuine in what you want to do and be specific and answer every question.
Yeah, and also I'll follow up with, I guess, more advice about what to do rather than what to avoid. Or I guess, yeah, I'll approach it from the kind of positive angle of like think about grant writing as a kind of sort of like genre of writing, just like similar to like academic writing, but it's not quite the same as like writing a peer-reviewed paper, even though there's some similarities. But just like sort of, fiction has different genres, and each genre has sort of ways of using language and tone and diction and that sort of stuff. Grant writing also has sort of conventions and ways to write and talk about what you want to do. And just like if you're trying to write a novel, you might look at a bunch of other novels to see like what works and what doesn't work in terms of like communicating your ideas. I would also recommend going and looking at both successful and unsuccessful grants if you're able to find them. And all of like the federal grants that Katie was talking about, you can go look at like the proposals that people submitted that got funded, as well as preliminary for MLS. You can look at preliminary proposals even for things that didn't get funded past like the initial sort of preliminary stage. So yeah, go look at a bunch of those proposals and sort of get a sense of how they frame their issues, how they talk about their plans or what they want to do, how they talk about the impact of the project that they're proposing. So yeah, go look at a bunch of other grants and get a sense of sort of the genre of what grant writing is.
Great. I think that was the last question. So thank you again so much to our panelists. And if you all do end up having more questions, you can feel free to send any of us an email.